video is to show you how to graph Limacons by analyzing equations. This was on our unit for convex, polar, and complex, and it was the graph Limacons by analyzing equations on March 18th, and it was homework number 37. Here are some general rules and equations that we've learned in previous lessons that are going to continue on in this lesson. Now here is the general form of a Limacon equation. So it would be r equals a plus or minus b sine theta, and r equals a plus or minus b cosine theta. Now, you can determine if it hits the pole or if it doesn't hit the pole by looking at just A and B. If the absolute value of A is greater than the absolute value of B, then you know that it doesn't hit the pole. But if it's the opposite, or equal to, if the absolute value of A is less than or equal to the absolute value of B, then you know that it does hit the pole.
So if it's a cosine graph, the majority of the graph will be on the x-axis. So for a positive cosine graph, the majority of the graph will be on the right side, and if it's a negative cosine graph, the majority of the graph will be on the left side. The same for sine. If it's a negative sine graph, the majority of the graph will be on the bottom. If it is a positive sine graph, the majority of the graph will be on the top. And that's shown right here. For the generic graph, these are the generic equations. A plus b will get you to the point of the graph without the dent or the dimple, and a minus b will get you to the part with the dimple or with the interloop, which would be right here. And A is just the short side distance.
R equals 3 plus 4 cosine theta. So the A is right here, 3, and the B is here, 4. So when A is less than B, that means it's interloop. Okay, so A plus B is 7, and that is negative 1. 3 minus 4. So A will go, when it's positive cosine x, cosine theta, it will be here. Majority of the graph will be here on the positive side of the x-axis. So A is 3. So here, and on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This will be A plus B, and the interloop goes inside, so 1. So when you draw it.
So the equation is r equals 2 plus 2 sine theta. And so A is 2 and B is also 2. And the absolute value of A and the absolute value of B are the same. So that makes this graph a heart or a cardioid. And since it's a sine and it's also positive, then it's going to be mostly on the upper y-axis. And A plus B is 4, which gives you the length of the longer side on the y-axis, and the absolute value of A minus the absolute value of B is 0, which means there's none on this side. And since A is 2, then on the opposite axis you have 2 on each side, so there's a point there and a point there. Then 4, you go up 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you just draw it, and it has to touch the origin since it's a heart.
Okay, so the equation for this graph is r equals 2 minus cosine theta. So a is 2, b is negative 1, and the absolute value of a is greater than the absolute value of b. The type for this graph is a bean or a dimple. A plus b is 3 for the absolute value of each, and a minus the absolute value of b is 1. So then you put your points here. Since a is 2, then this is how far it goes there. It's a cosine graph, so it's on the x-axis. Since it's negative, it's mostly on the left. And
equation is r equals 3 minus 5 sine theta, and it's a negative sign, so that means it's going to be on this half of the graph, and a is 3 and b is 5. So the absolute value of a is less than the absolute value of b, meaning that it is an interloop. And then the absolute value of a plus the absolute value of b is going to be 8. And the absolute value of a minus the absolute value of b is 2. So then 8 is going to be it's going to be this long side. And 2 is going to be the loop inside the interloop. So it's going to be 1, 2. And a on the opposite axis is 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3. And since this negative sign is down here, so
So in conclusion, or in summary, we're just going to review all of the major points that we covered in this lesson. So here are the general equations for a limazone, and it will be r equals a plus or minus b sine theta, and r equals a plus or minus b cosine theta. And again, that is just the general equations, and the ratio and inequalities to find what shape the graph will be is these two equations, which are exactly the same. Again, you have a preference on which one you want to use. Will be the absolute value of a over b is less than 1, or the absolute value of a is less than the absolute value of b. If it fits these criteria, then you are going to have an interloop, which will always be on the polar, or it will always hit the pole. And then in the middle here is a cardioid, and you're going to have a cardioid if it equals 1, if the absolute value of a over b equals 1, or if the absolute value of a equals the absolute value of b. And finally, we have the last shape, which could be called a bean or a dimple, and that is if the absolute value of a over b is greater than 1, or if the absolute value of a is greater than the absolute value of b. So moving on to how you determine how the structure of the graph is. If it is a cosine graph, then it's going to be along the x-axis, and if it is a sine graph, then it's going to be vertical or along the y-axis. Now, also, if it's positive, it's going to be on the right side or up in cases of sine graphs, and if it's negative, it's going to be on the left side or down in the sign of sine graphs. Now, these are how you determine the height, lower point, and just how to graph the graph in general. So a plus b is going to show us the height, or how far it stretches on the main axis. So this is a sine graph, and you know that because it's going along the y-axis. So this is a plus b, and a minus b is going to show us our lower point, where the interloop is, or where the point of the cardioid is. And a is going to show us how far it stretches on the opposite axis on one side. So if you want this total, then you're going to have to say that's 2a, but if it is a cosine graph, then you know that the a is going to be along the y-axis, and if it's a sine graph, then you know that the a is going to be along the x-axis because they're opposites.